Okay, sample problem 2.6. Name the following species: BrO4 minus, HCO3 minus, and SO3 2 minus. So these are all examples of polyatomic ions. As I've said before, you want to memorize polyatomic ions, but there's a lot of them, it turns out, and so memorizing all of them can be kind of challenging, but there are some patterns we're going to look for. So I'm going to start with A, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a list of 3 sets of polyatomic ions, starting with chlorine, just so you can see the pattern. These are actually a relatively important set of polyatomic ions. Okay, so these involve chlorine. That's not Ci, it's Cl for chlorine. So there's only 2 elements in each of these polyatomic ions, chlorine and oxygen. So there's the first set. The second set is very similar. It just has bromine instead of chlorine. So there's a pattern here. Now remember, bromine is in the same column, group 7A, as chlorine. Those are halogens, they're called. And then finally, there's one more here, and that's iodine. So when elements are in the same column, they tend to have the same behaviors. So right here, all 3 of these elements, chlorine, bromine, iodine, have the same behavior. It turns out fluorine, which is also in the column, the first element in that column, 7A, doesn't have this pattern, but these ones do. And here's the pattern of naming them. We want the names to be very similar to one another, but be different so we can tell the difference. So here's how it works. We start by saying hypo and then chlorite. Hypochlorite. The next one, where there's 2 oxygens, you just drop the hypo and you just call it chlorite. Next one, chlorate. So when you get to 3 oxygens, it jumps up to 8. And then when you get to 4 oxygens, you put in a perchlorate. In a sense, per is short for hyper. Hyper meaning a lot. Hypo means under or less. So you have hypo at the first one, and then per at the last one. And then the first 2 are ite, and then the next 2 are 8. So more oxygens goes from hypochlorite, chlorite, chlorate, perchlorate. Okay? Now here's what's nice about that. The other 2 sets do exactly the same thing. We just change it from chlorine to bromine or iodine. So this one oxygen is hypo, but now it's bromite. Second one, you drop the hypo, bromite. Third one, you change the ending to ate, bromate. Fourth one, you add the perbromate. Okay? So hypobromite, bromite, bromate, perbromate. And then the same thing, you may try these ones here. Try it with the iodine. It's iodine instead of bromine. So this would become hypo, right? The one that only has 1 oxygen is hypo. Iodite. Ite has fewer oxygens than 8. Second one, you drop the hypo, iodite. Third one, you change the ending to 8, iodate. Fourth one, you add the periodate. Okay? These are all ions, so if you technically, you would call it the hypochlorite ion, the chlorate ion. So our first one in part A is BrO4 minus. That's the perbromate ion. Now the second one, the issue here is what happens when you add a hydrogen to something. So this is called carbonate. Again, it's the carbonate ion. If you add a hydrogen, the charge goes down by 1. So instead of being -2, it's -1. And you just call it hydrogen carbonate. Okay? So carbonate doesn't have any hydrogens. If you add a hydrogen, it becomes hydrogen carbonate. This one does have a common name. It's called bicarbonate. Sodium bicarbonate, right? That's baking soda. So let me give you another example. Let's take this one, SO3 2-. This is just one you need to memorize. SO3 2- is called the sulfite ion. Okay? If you were to add a hydrogen, it would be hydrogen sulfite. They didn't do that in this one, in that particular example, but it would be called hydrogen sulfite. And therefore, you could call it bisulfite. Now, let's compare that to SO4 2-. Just like with these element, or I'm sorry, with these polyatomic ions over here, when you add one more oxygen, it goes from 8 to 8. Same thing here. This is called sulfate. So SO3 is sulfite, SO4 is sulfate. What happens if you add a hydrogen? Well, the charge goes to -1 instead of -2, and you would call that hydrogen sulfate or bisulfate. Do the same thing with phosphate. PO4 -3, phosphate. Remember, these are polyatomic ions you need to memorize. They're in the table in this section. If you add one hydrogen, it becomes -2, and this is called hydrogen phosphate. Now, because phosphate has a charge of -3, you could actually add another hydrogen to it, and now it becomes -1, 2 hydrogens, and this would be called dihydrogen phosphate. Dihydrogen phosphate. There you go. So adding a hydrogen as well.